Hello, Merry Meet. So, I have been reading a book and I thought I would make a review about it. But first, let me just explain why I haven't made any videos lately. Uh, um, the, mm, I have been visiting my mother. Originally, I was planning to stay for 1 week, but then there were some personal issues, so I have stayed for 2 weeks. And in addition, on the week leading up to me going, there were some difficulties that I might talk about later, so I haven't had the opportunity to make a lot of videos for the last 3 weeks. So yeah, also MB, no, I am not wearing my rings, I'm only wearing my engagement ring and wedding ring because it's hot, it's summer, and I didn't really feel like dressing up just to make a video. Usually when I am dressed up, it's because I am anyway going out or having other plans and I make a video at the same time. But it's not that often I dress up just to make a video. So, all that blabber out of the way, let's get on to the book. It is Modern Wicca, a history from Gerard Gardner to the present by Michael Howard. And it's published by Llewellyn. Now, this is a history book. It describes the history of Wicca from before it really started, with some about Gerard Gardner's childhood and also the folk magic and witchcraft traditions in England at the time, and explores a lot of what made Wicca what it is today. Michael Howard has been in Wicca for a long time and he knows a lot of these people that were involved in the formation of Wicca, and as such it is a book written from an insider's perspective. Now this is of course both good and bad. On the good side, it means that he has a lot of information about these topics. But of course you will then end up with him being biased. It's almost impossible not to be. And at times you can see the biases where he speaks more favorably about the organizations he has been a part of and more negatively about the others. However, I do think he managed to balance it out. Excuse me, there's a car going by. I think he has managed to balance it out fairly well. And one thing I really like about this book is that he is very careful with informing the reader where the information he is providing has some sort of proof to it. For example, there can be official documents or newspaper articles or secondary witnesses, or where it is just hearsay. So I think that adds to the credibility of the book. So let's begin with going through the index, shall we? We have an introduction, which basically just introduces the topic and goes into some of the reasons why the author wanted to write this book. Then we have part 1, beginnings. We have chapter 1, journeying into foreign lands, chapter 2, into the wild witch cult, and chapter 3, the pick and gill connection. This basically describes Gerard Gardner's early life and how he got into witchcraft. His tendency, basically he was a man that really loved to travel, and he took jobs in the Far East, and there got into contact with several magical groupings and traditions, and as such had a background when he went back to England and got into contact with both folk magic and some witchcraft groups. And it also discusses the pick and gill connection. Basically, pick and gill was a cunning man, one of the really famous ones in English history, and a lot of people think that a big part of his ideas has made its way into Wicca because they think that the New Forest coven that Garrett Gardner claims he made contact with was formed basically on the ideas from Pick and Gill. So those are very interesting chapters. Then you have part 2, development. We have Garrett Gardner and the Great Beast, a magical book of shadows, and the Museum of Witchcraft. It basically talks about 3 very important steps in the formation of Wicca. Let me just adjust this camera a little bit. There we go. So one of the chapters, one of the really big ones here, it's about 20 pages I think, goes into the connection between Wicca and Aleister Crowley. A lot of modern Wiccan today doesn't even know that there was a connection there, and they demonize Crowley and all that the man stands for without realizing that a huge part of what we know of Wicca today was developed by this man. Because not only were both Crowley and Garrett Gardner moving in the same occult circles, both was interested in Golden Dawn, both were interested in the same occult ideas. But we can see a lot of Crowley's ideas in the early Wiccan works. And in fact, Garrett Gardner hired Crowley to write a lot of the rituals that you find in his Book of Shadows. It was only later when, I think it was Doreen Valiente, was hired in to remove some of Crowley's influences and change the book of the Gerardian Book of Shadows, that some of his influences was removed. Otherwise, you could see it very, very clear. And in fact, a lot of Thelemites and members of the OTO considers Wicca to be one of the outer orders to their own organization, since Gardner had a charter that written from Crowley that he paid for, that enabled him to set up a chapter of OTO and initiate people in it. And that was how he was allowed by Crowley to use his work within Wicca. So there's a very, very strong connection there. And we know that the two men talked with one another extensively. Then we have a chapter about the Magical Book of Shadows, which describes the history of the Gerardian Book of Shadows. And the Museum of Witchcraft, which was one of the things that got things started when Garrett Gardner started. Well, he didn't actually start it. It was another man that started it, but he became one of those that made it popular. And Museum of Witchcraft. And it also was extremely influential on the development of Wicca. Then we have chapter 3, expansion, where we have Witchcraft Today, Enemies Within and Without, and New Witch Blood. It basically describes Witchcraft Today, which was the first non-fictional work on witchcraft that Garrett Gardner wrote, if you do not consider his work on ritual knives, which came before, but that wasn't within Western witchcraft. And then we have basically some discussion of the schisms within Wicca and how it started to develop. Now, the sections about schisms here, those really read like some sort of soap opera, because there's a lot of he said, and really these old English occultists, they love the being dicks to one another. I mean, really, really, really dicks to one another. And from my experience being an occultist for most of my life, that hasn't really changed. There's a lot of these ideas that, no, we are the real ones, and anybody else, they are imposters. And that is extremely common. And it really goes through a lot of these correspondences between people in the early Wiccan community and how much of a dick they manage to be to one another. And yeah, it can be an amusing but somewhat frustrating read. Then we have evolution, we have pretenders and rivals, the king of the witches, the politics of Wicca, and the pagan federation emerges. Basically, this section goes a lot about Alexander's and his development, the development of Wicca within the United States, other threats to the movement, like the witch media craze, where of course witches were portrayed as orgy having devil worshippers. And here you very much see the author's bias, because while he do have some connection with Sanders, he's clearly more on the Gerardian side. And also this might come as a surprise to a lot of people who are Gerardian Wiccans. Traditionally, Gerardians and Alexandrian Wiccans didn't really get along that well, though they are both basically the only two recognized paths today that are considered traditional Wicca, which is a bit odd because there was a lot of other paths too that was started by people who were just as close to the source material as Alexander's, also initiated by direct initiatory descendants of Jared Gardner, and which has kept their traditions far closer to the original than Sanders, but that still are not considered to be traditional Wiccans. And that's a bit weird, but yes, it goes through a lot of that history, and that's very interesting. Then you have the future, which basically goes through the story from the 1980s to present day. We have Wicca International, Witches in Cyberspace, and Wiccans of the 91st century. Now, this basically goes through where are the movement today, a lot about how it changed from being an extremely conservative movement, and that focused just on that magic and preserving these old practices. Because yes, let me just get that out of the way. This book does not really advocate for the idea that a lot of modern Wiccans have today, that Wicca is thousands and thousands of years old, because there are no evidence of that. There's some, basically that came into Wicca with Dr. Murray, who wrote about a witch cult that was a survivor of old Stone Age societies. Or was it Iron Age? Anyway, far, far back. And which has somehow then survived today. And some people do then believe that. But originally what a lot claimed was that it could perhaps be traced a couple of 100 years back to the Picking-Gill tradition, and that there have been groups of people practicing a mystery cult based on the goddess for a few hundred years in England, which is a much more believable claim because mystery cults have popped up every so often. So yes, let me just say that and get out of the way. It does discuss that topic, and it has a pretty good stance on it, though the book is very careful with not offering extreme support to one side or the other. What it does discuss, however, is the developments from a very conservative idea of preserving this, that were both extremely homophobic and rather misogynistic, to what we have today, which is religion that is definitely usually on the far left, and has been associated with a lot of social activism and a fight for equal rights. Because Jared Gardner was a homophobe of dimensions, and for a long time the official stance of Wicca was that now you could not be lesbian or gay and be a Wiccan, going so far as to saying that if you tried to practice witchcraft and you were gay, you would be punished by the goddess, because you needed to have that flow of male to female energy. And there was also a lot of misogynism. For example, a man could be initiated by a man or a woman, but a woman could only be initiated by a man, and a man could practice alone, but a woman could only practice with a man. And of course within a coven structure that had both men and women. And there were ideas that, for example, a woman should, if you had a high priestess, she had to step down when she got old and allow a younger, prettier woman to become the high priestess. Though this wasn't really practiced, as many of the high priestesses was in fact old. But it was a very misogynistic path in the beginning, and extremely conservative, and a lot of those that started the movement were in fact army people. They were on quite towards the far right and had really very bigoted ideas. But in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this changed, and you had people like, for example, Starrock and Margaret Adler, and several other feminist Wiccans that fought both for the rights of gay witches and also for the rights of women, and also an idea of environmentalism come into it. So that's a very interesting part of it. This section also discusses hopes and dreams for the movement in the future and Wicca when it comes to the internet. Though the chapter on the internet is a bit strange because it goes all over the place. It's a little bit about the end of Alexander's, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and perhaps a few pages at the back of the chapter about actually internet and witchcraft. We do present a very interesting idea about why witches were so ready to accept the internet, while it is, generally speaking, a very technophobic movement, and seeing the vast movement of a World Wide Web as a kind of magic in its own. And I do like that. I really, really like that. So yes, those are the chapters, and of course there is a bibliography and a contact list, and yeah. So what do I think about this book? I think it's very, very good. Now, it's definitely more of a scholarly book, and there's a lot of details that some people might find boring, a lot of this person's in this date on this year wrote this letter to that person which led to such. So there's basically this vast yarn ball of information that how Wicca became what it is today, but it is very interesting. And I do actually recommend a lot of people to reading it because it do sort out a lot of the misconceptions about Wicca. For example, the idea that all these founders were, they never cast a curse, they went always into the Wiccan read. But no, Kenneth Gardner cast plenty of curses. It sort of, in one way, it kicks a lot of these people down from pedestals. We all like to see Garrett Gardner as this witch saint that, and in many ways he did as a great service, because if we hadn't had Garrett Gardner, we wouldn't have had the easy access to information about witchcraft as we do today. But at the same time, he was definitely homophobic and he did some terrible things. Alexander's was a great ritual magician and witch, very knowledgeable, and he did a lot to promote the craft, but at the same time he was a media whore and treated his wife, wives actually, because he had a series of them, horribly. There's and in one way it kicks the pedestal under these figures, but at the same time making them appear very human. And it is a very interesting look from an insider's point of view on how Wicca became what it is today. And I think it can be a very useful book for a lot of people to read, because it might surprise you to learn some of these things that a lot of people just don't know. For example, just how involved Aleister Crowley was with the development of Modern Wicca. So yeah, it's a book I definitely do recommend. It is a little bit on the dry side, but it is also very well written, and I found that reading it goes pretty quickly. The information retention is pretty good because there's a very nice flow to the language. if I were to make one complaint, it is this: the author is not very good at sectioning information. You have chapters that's supposed to be about one thing, but he goes on tangents. So while you sort of have a narrative starting at the beginning and ending at the present day, it's a little bit all over the place. Other than that, this is a very good book. I definitely do recommend it. I think it seems very authentic, and it gives a very good idea about how this religion started and became what it is today. So that is my review of Modern Wicca, a history from Gerald Gardner to the present by Michael Howard. So yeah, I hope you have enjoyed that review. Have a great day, and blessed be.